Ladies and gentlemen, I have finished Final Fantasy VI, and I figured I should talk a little bit about it. Honestly, I think I went into the game with a little bit of a stigma. I'm a big fan of Chrono Trigger, and I saw this game kind of like a rival, something that always was compared to this game I liked, so I was kind of unsure, how I would take it. This kind of thinking is probably something I should get rid of, mostly just because it kept me from experiencing games like this until I shake it off. I'm happy to say I really enjoyed Final Fantasy VI because of a number of things. Coming out of it, I'm actually not sure which one of those two RPGs is better, and I'm not sure I actually want to debate it at all. Maybe it's kind of just like a fool's errand to kind of determine stuff like that. Maybe it's just like a distraction to keep you from enjoying them as their own thing. Anyways, Final Fantasy VI stuck out to me because of the depth that it has with its character and its plot. And obviously, depth is very subjective because of its application. Some people will scoff at the classic heroes save the world storyline, but I think it's the way that it was executed that kind of sets it apart. Each character has its own arc, or his or her own arc rather, that is either focused on them or, they participate in other people's. During these scenes, we learn a lot about character motivations and, more importantly, how they interact with each other. We get to see little bits of banter, we get to see emotion, we get to see emoting, which is really important. Because there's a lot of characters in general, there's a large cast of characters. There's a degree of splitting up and choosing who you want to approach situations with. You got to make your party, you got to construct it of 4 or 5 different people. Actually, sorry, a maximum of 4 different people. Some situations you're working with 3 or 2 or whatever. And I found that some little scenes you could only get if you had 2 or 3 specific people along. So there is a scene in the game where Edgar and Sabin, who are brothers, and both kind of princes to a kingdom, eventually make it back to this castle for the first time that they own, or they rule over. And there's this nice little scene where they talk to each other and figure something out with the chancellor, and it's kind of just like, we wouldn't have got that scene if those characters weren't present. And because it's fully possible to miss characters in the latter half of the game in terms of getting them all back together after this giant world cataclysm event, it really kind of sets up some situations where you can choose who to go through the game with and who is along for certain events, and I think that's awesome. It's mostly awesome, mostly just because it's the opposite of the situation where you would make scenes too generic, and because anyone could approach them, you kind of have to fit dialogue to multiple people's mouths. So this happened in Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger has situations where the game determines who the closest thing to a smart party member is, and usually it's Luca or Robo. So Luca's a scientist, Robo is a robot from the future. So if you need to explain something in a time travel sense or a scientific sense, you go to one of those two characters. And if you don't have either of them in your party, you kind of go down a hierarchy of who the next smartest person is. And Chrono, the main character and who's supposed to be the player analog, he doesn't talk at all. So it kind of means that you have to have other characters speak for him, or you have to have characters speak lines that are either very generic, so anyone could say them, or they just have very little bits of variance. It just kind of feels that sometimes it delves into one size fits all, and you sacrifice a little bit of specificity for that. Having certain characters react differently in certain situations really brings out just their unique character. And I guess I abuse that word a lot, but making them seem unique makes it easier for you to emotionally connect with them, and that's really important. Like I said, Final Fantasy VI, you have a large cast. You have 14 possible characters and 12 talking ones, which again makes it really harder to hedge those bets because just the massive amount of combinations that you can have, you either write something that, like I said, it's utterly generic, or we go for what the developers kind of did and just threw in little tweaks, just little bits of emotes, just little bits of differences that makes them unique. The game also does a really good job of making sure that characters get used, because in some situations you have to split parties, you have to split your entire roster into separate parties, or they get separated by the story and they get put into these scenarios. There was 2 different points of this in the game where you would be brought to a menu where you would choose, okay, I want to go to play with this character first and do that little mini storyline before we come back to this menu and tackle the other 2. I thought that was really good. I've actually never really thought about that in terms of experiencing that in a game before, and it really allowed me to control the pacing of the story. So what happens, without any major spoilers, is you're with a party of 4 people for a very long time, and then eventually it splits up to the point where you have 2 of that main party and then 1 and 1. So there's 3 different scenarios. So you have them just going off in their own different directions. And because I had dealt with that party of 4 for such a long time, I either had the choice of, what I did anyway was I dealt with the last 2, the 2 isolated members, and then came back to the majority of the party. So I did each individual storyline there, and then came back to the 2 that were remaining. And it was like, because I did those 2 separately, it was fresh coming back. You know, it's like I had taken some time away from these characters. It was like an aside or a couple episodes in a story where you haven't seen, or like a TV show rather, where you haven't seen characters for a while, and then they come back and you're like, oh my god, okay, I haven't seen you in a while. What's happened in the meantime? And then we can inform our context based on what we've experienced in those side stories or those other parallel stories. Or if I wanted to, I didn't do this, and if I was to replay the game, I might have done this, was you can take that party that you were playing with and you just continue their story right away, and you kind of keep that momentum going, and then after that's all resolved or whatever, you can go and do the other storyline. So that was really cool. It was really my thing. I really enjoyed the game. I was really nervous about it because there's a praise for characters, and I was worried that it would be good for a video game. You know, like, okay, this is a good story, but it's still a video game in the end. I found myself really, like I said, getting really engaged with the characters, despite, you know, there being relatively lo-fi sprites, you know, 16-bit sprites. You can only really get so much emotiveness out of that. It's not like they're like fully facial rigged models or anything like that, but I really like that subtle pixel differences, like subtle differences in the pixels and the sprites just really went as far as they could with providing character and reactions and that kind of stuff. The only thing that I felt really lacking with the game was the openness of the magic system, and there's a hard wall that you hit like halfway and at the end points of the game where the leveling system really catches up with you. In order to get magic, you have to equip espers or magicite to different characters, and they can either provide magic as you level up, or they can provide stat bonuses as you level up, or they can do both. But usually if they do both, it's a lesser stat bonus and less useful magic. So it's kind of like you have to change and figure things out, and it's just like a giant daunting task to just like craft the perfect party member. And sometimes I found that I was keeping an Esper attached to a certain person for the entire game because of the stats bonuses, or I would run into a situation where I would have a party, but no one would have white magic that could cure people or revive people, and you'd kind of be scrambling in order to make sure that you actually had something useful. To the other point, it's likely my lack of leveling and kind of the game's pace. The game's pace really doesn't make you grind until you hit these hard walls of experience, and despite 2 characters needing to grind, like there's 2 characters that basically learn spells and abilities by fighting monsters, and if you miss those monsters, there's a place you can go in order to get back those spells and that kind of stuff. But it tends to be really tedious, and the pace of the game's story basically makes you ignore them, and it's very easy to ignore them if you don't use those characters. I found them very annoying to use. So basically, there's a chance that you're going to hit a wall where all your characters are underleveled, the game turns really hard, and then you don't know where to grind. You don't know where to get your experience up. For me, having to look that up and having to find that, thankfully in the end game, there is a place where you can exclusively run into high experience monsters in order to make yourself more prepared. That was a saving grace, but not all games have that. So it's kind of just, like I said, a little bit of a victim of a pacing issue, rather, where it's like almost the pacing is too good, and then they decide to throw a challenge there where you might not be prepared for. Thankfully, like I said, this doesn't hamstring my enjoyment of the game too much, but mostly adds just like stalls. And otherwise, game's awesome. I really like it. If you're an RPG fan, definitely should be in your backlog. You definitely should play it, at least for the context of knowing that at that time in 1994, people were trying to craft very good and very deep character experiences in order to make you feel something. And it isn't just like a twist on the generic, oh yeah, okay, let's get the crystals, let's fight the bad guy, let's, you know, get the girl and go home. No, there's actually some depth there in terms of just like each character examining things that are important to them, that shape them as people, and then they all get to mesh together, and you get to see how that works. Thanks for listening to this Post-Mortem. I've decided that the next game that I'm going to be tackling is Paper Mario and the Thousand-Year Door. It's a game for the GameCube that I guess is the start of me actually tackling something a little bit more modern. A lot of people really like this game, so I'm really looking forward to it. I actually have never played it before. I've played Paper Mario 1 for the Nintendo 64, but never really dove into this too much. So I'll be making a video about that, and then I will announce when I will be tackling it on stream. I hope to see you guys all there. Thanks again.